share for people listening that are in a relationship or want to be in a relationship some of the red flags that you've seen as a divorce attorney for these last 2 decades?
That term walking on eggshells is a real thing. When you feel like you are modifying who you are, what you say, expressing yourself in order to avoid the conflict because you don't want to deal with it, like that's a massive red flag. Every decision that you should make should be because it's a heart-based decision. You know it's right, you know it's the next step, and not because of a lack of not having what you need and resources in order to do that.
All right, guys, I am so excited for you to hear this conversation that I'm having with my dear friend, author, divorce attorney extraordinaire, Renée Bauer. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh my God, Candy, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad that we're doing this because although we've known each other now for, I think, 2 years-ish, we haven't officially done a podcast on the show. And I thought, what better time with you having a book out to expose you to my audience, because not only do you have this new book and you've got all this amazing stuff that you're doing, but you have so much knowledge of being in the legal world for the last 20 years. And I think anyone that's listening, no matter where you are in business or as an investor, you're in a relationship, whether that's a married relationship, you're dating. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about, let's unpack those 20 years that you have of all of this expertise, and maybe share for people listening that are in a relationship or want to be in a relationship, some of the red flags that you've seen as a divorce attorney for these last 2 decades.
I have, you know why I love this question is because not just seeing it, like I lived it. Like I had the red flags waving in front of my face and I ignored all of them because I'm twice divorced. And when you go through that, like you can do the job as a professional. You can walk the walk and, you know, click clack down the hallway in high heels and like show up as a professional. But when it's in your own personal life, we tend to ignore our own red flags. And what I found fascinating was there's so many high level, high powered entrepreneurs, 7 figures, 8-figure earners who are also in these relationships that aren't aligned, that there's a ton of red flags that are toxic, and it feels like a failure to them, and they stay and they hold on because they feel like, you know, I'm no quitter. I'm not going to quit this relationship, and they stay too long. So what do the red flags look like? That term walking on eggshells is a real thing. When you feel like you are modifying who you are, what you say, expressing yourself in order to avoid the conflict because you don't want to deal with it, like that's a massive red flag. For me, I used to change who I was hanging out with because if my husband at the time, my second one, didn't like those friends, it was easier for me to change the plans than to actually go ahead and have those lunches and dinner dates. And so when you start to change, if you're seeing your family or friends, huge red flags too. Those are the top 2 that reign really true for me at being in that space, being a business owner, being a leader, being a boss. And yet there I was in this really toxic relationship and not doing anything about it. And I kept saying, okay, all the other stuff, like I can rationalize my way out of this. We can fix this. And those things are really, really hard to fix.
Yeah. And do you think that in your experience, not just with your own story, but with probably thousands of clients at this point in 20 years, do you think high performing individuals tend to stay longer or do they quit quicker?
I think they stay longer because I think that they think if I just work harder, if I just put more effort in, like we can make this work, we can fix it. And I think it's that mentality that makes us so successful as entrepreneurs, right? It's like, we're not going to allow rejection to take over us. We're not going to allow failure to run our lives. So we're not going to fail at this relationship thing. And I've seen so many high level entrepreneurs stay and not leave. And sometimes they're the problem too. Sometimes because we are so invested in our business and that is our first relationship and our first love, sometimes we put our relationships on the back burner and we're neglecting our spouse and we're not really attuned to what they need because we think that we're doing this for the sake of the family. We're doing it to provide. So why don't you understand that all of my time is into this thing? So this is like, for any of your listeners, it's like, are you that person too? Are you the one who is putting all of your time and energy and you have nothing left to give your partner, who is craving and begging for just a little bit of your affection and time?
And that, what's so hard from my experience too, is having that discernment, knowing what is, because none of us want to be quitters. So it's like, how do we know that the hard is okay and it's still right, and that this is how a relationship's supposed to be, or the hard is wrong and it means that we shouldn't, right? It's kind of like that. People always say, kick down every door. Well, sometimes the doors they're actually trying to point you to a different door or a window. Do you have any, maybe in your experience, that you can just share some insight so that people know how to choose their hard?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because it's so personal, and we can't just list to say, hey, if everything in your relationship lines up on this column, then keep working at it. And if it's in this, then throw in the towel. But it's, part of it's like that gut instinct that something is not right, something is not aligned. It's not just a disconnection. Because I think when couples are disconnected, it happens all of the time. In the most long-lasting relationships, you have a moment or a season where there's a disconnect. Things are happening, maybe kids are taking up your time or your businesses, and there's a season where you are kind of passing by each other and you have to take that effort to come back together. That's worth working on, because when you come back together, you still like each other and you still know how to communicate. You still want to spend time together. But when you have that complete breakdown because of other things that are happening that are maybe outside of your control, maybe it's time. I mean, I always tell people, never file for divorce until you at least try to do marriage counseling, because usually, not because it could save your marriage, it gives you clarity on whether this is a relationship that you want to continue to work on or it's time to pack it in. And I had gone to marriage counseling one time, and the counselor actually called me and said, listen, like, I commend that you're trying this, but you know what? Sometimes you just have to walk away. And it was like, that was the permission that I needed to know, like, I did everything I could in order to then make that decision. And sometimes that professional help will really shed light on what you should be doing for your next step.
Yeah. And I love that, because I think professional help, especially, not always, but a lot of guys tend to not like that, at least in my experience too. But I think that it's so valuable, because even if it doesn't fix the problem, like you said, it gives you clarity. But I want to touch back on one thing you said that I know in my own life, anytime, relationship or not, that I made mistakes, it was because I ignored a gut instinct. We ignore it, then we rationalize it, and then make decisions to support it. Do you see that people, they do that? And is there anything that maybe you can give guidance that, like, when you feel that gut instinct, here's how to maybe unpack it and to listen more astutely to it?
I don't know anyone who doesn't ignore that gut instinct a few times, a handful of times, before they start to pay attention to it. It's hard, right? Like, we don't want to have to listen to that voice that's like telling us this is not, like, it's not going to work. It's not okay. It's time to make a move. Like, it's really hard. And so, I write it down. If it comes up, write it down quickly, like pull up your phone and just have notes of like, okay, what thought is coming to you? And then when you start to see those same thoughts show up for you over and over again, and it's a pattern, Candy, I think sometimes it's just time. Like, sometimes we just have to have enough of those little, like, almost like little gnats, like whispering in your ear saying, it's time, like, you can't fix this. It's, waving that red flag for you to really start to pay attention. And eventually we do pay attention to that. And then we look back and said, well, we had the red flags from 5 years ago, but sometimes that's just the journey. Like, that was just the course of the relationship. You weren't ready to have it come to completion. And, there was still a lesson to be learned in all of this. And then you walk away. And I think the key is walking away and saying, okay, what did I bring to that relationship? What can I own? And how can I make sure I don't repeat that mistake in the next one?
Yeah, because without the experience, we don't have the wisdom, right? And I think that that's unfortunately what happens, is we don't have the wisdom to say, don't ignore the gut instinct, because we didn't have the data to learn earlier that when we do that, bad things happen. And I do want to just preface it. Anytime we talk about relationships, I always just want to say that if anyone is listening now and you're in an abusive relationship, it is, whether it's mentally, physically, emotionally, I don't care what the level of abuse is. We don't measure abuse. It is what it is. This does not apply to you. That type of hard is not something that you should ever endure. So I always like to throw that in here, because from being in not the best relationships in my life, I would hear things like this, and then it would reinforce, I just got to work harder. I just got to do better. So if you're listening and that's you, this does not apply to you. Get out, because it's probably worse than you even think. Because when you're inside of the container, you can't see how bad it is until you get out and really look.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and I knew you would agree with that as well. So I love that. And I also think with relationships, sometimes we think that fine is good enough, right? Well, it's fine. It's okay. And I don't necessarily think that fine is an indicator that you should get out of a relationship, but I do think that it is a 4-letter word. It does lean to mediocrity. And I don't think anything great and passionate can come from that. Can you maybe explain a little bit of why you think fine is a 4-letter word, and what we could do to get out of that?
I think it's almost like purgatory. And, I have so many friends in fine relationships, and they're not happy. They're on this hamster wheel. They're disconnected from their spouse. They're definitely not having joy in the relationship. There is not any kindness. They might still say, oh, but I love my spouse, but it's, it's kind of like whitewash. I love my spouse, but I don't necessarily like them. And I think when you also have to like your spouse, and I think that fine is kind of the same thing, that sometimes fine is us sleepwalking through our life. Like, I want to be with someone who truly challenges me to be my best self, also supports me, who's safe, to know that I can go to and say, there is something bothering me. We have to have a conversation. Like, to have that safety around whatever communication there is. Like, that's the type of relationship. And I don't think fine necessarily fits that. I see fine as really just being this stagnant. We're living in the same house. We're doing the chores, doing the things, getting through our life, surviving. But I would think anyone would want more than survival in a relationship. And life is just way too short to stay stuck in something where you don't have a true deep connection with that person. That doesn't mean there aren't road bumps. Of course there are. Like, it's reality. Every relationship goes through that. But can you come back together and get back to that place where you're like, I choose you over and over and over again, and you know why? And usually when someone's just fine, they can't actually say that they would choose that person again.
That's interesting. There's a lot of wisdom in there to see, would you choose that person over again? And it's not to say that I personally don't think that any relationship or life is perfect. And those people that put it out there on social media that it is probably have the biggest issues of us all. But I think that no matter what, there are challenges. But if you start a relationship, and I know I've heard different people say this differently, but this is kind of my version of it. In the beginning of the relationship, if you don't rationalize any red flags, if you don't fantasize about their potential, if you don't maybe think that you can rescue or fix this person, and you just see them for who they are and assume that they are never going to evolve or get better over the course of the next 50 years, would you still sign up for it? And I feel like if that was a condition of getting into a relationship, a lot of us would avoid bad ones.
Yeah, I always say to clients, so I would have people come to me and they'd be like, well, how do you know? And they're crowdsourcing, like they're asking friends, they're asking family, they're asking lawyers to make this decision for them. And so I throw a question back to them and I say, okay, if this was your daughter who came to you and was in the same exact marriage you're in, would you want her to stay? And most people say, no, I want her to be happy. So why is that okay? Not okay for her, but it's okay for you. And if you just ask yourself that question, is your marriage or your relationship okay if it was your child? And if you say no, then that's the answer that you need.
Yeah, that's so valuable. I've heard it like your friend, but like when you put it as your daughter or your son, like, oh gosh, that just kind of like takes it to a whole other level. Now, you've obviously had all of this experience helping people, guiding people through this. You've had your own personal story, and then you've taken all of that and recently wrote a book, which is coming out this week, which I'm so excited about. For everyone that listens to the end, we actually are going to do a giveaway so that you can get your copy of the book as well. And we'll put all of that in the show notes. But I want to just talk a little bit about why you decided to write this book and who it's really for.
Yeah. So when I was deciding to write the book, it was a divorce book. And at some point, so I had sent a proposal to my agent, and then I reached out to her. I'm like, you know what? This is not the book. Like, it's too late in the process when we start talking about divorce. I want to get to the root of the problem. And after spending 20 years working with women, I realized the problem is not the breakdown of their marriage. The problem is worthiness issues, women having uncomfortable conversations and being okay with it, women expressing their needs, what they want, women having conversations about money and really owning that piece of their life and having that financial literacy. I'm like, those were the things I wanted to write about. I'm like, let's get ahead of it, because the breakdown of the marriage happens at some point in their journey because they're not having the uncomfortable conversations. They're not speaking their truth. They're not speaking what they need and want out of a marriage. They're not saying, hey, I need to know what's happening in our finances. And that was the premise behind the book, was for any woman at any point who's at a crossroads to say, okay, now what? Now what? Is this as good as it gets? Like, is this what my life looks like? Or are there dreams that I'm not going after because I'm scared, because I have fear? And whatever that is, whether it's leaving a marriage, starting the business, picking up and moving cross country, it doesn't matter what that is for you. But whatever it is, like if you find yourself in this place of purgatory where you're like, okay, this is just the way my life is. No, it's not. You know that. I know that. Like, there's so much more, but you have to be brave enough to go for it. And that's what this book is all about.
I love it. And She Who Wins obviously is speaking to women, because your practice is predominantly dealt with women. And is I think there's a stat that like 70% of all marriages are initiated by women. That was as of 2022 when I was doing research for your interview. But that's not to say that this book, and I know you personally, so I know this isn't the truth, but when people hear women empowerment, they also relate that to anti-men. Yes,
it's not. It's absolutely not. And it's funny because I hosted an event a few months ago, and we had so many men in the room who I thought would be intimidated by stepping into a room that was called She Who Went, and it's not the case at all. And I've had men read this book and say, well, this all applies to me. The framework you teach applies to me too. I just share it in the lens of my lens. And my lens is from that female perspective. And a lot of it is self-worth and body image issues and confidence issues. And so really anyone can read it. It's certainly not an anti-man book. It's not. In fact, I think that when you have a really supportive spouse and a husband who supports you, like, the sky's the limit, and you show up as a better wife, as a better mom, as a better boss, like all of the things. And that's really what the position is. So, I would hope that any man would pick it up and find that it resonates with them too, because even my stories are probably not all just female focused.
Yeah. And I always say too, it's like real men, like true, real alpha men, not the ones that claim they are, but real alpha men want women to be more involved and to be more educated and be surrounded by people that they care about. It's the toxic and abusive situations that don't. So being with someone that's like, oh my gosh, I heard about this on a podcast, I'm going to grab this book for you, or for your daughter, or for your sister. Like, I think that's really valuable. And you said something about money, which of course, as you know, is my content, money, business, wealth. And I do see over and over again, women not getting involved in finance. Some of them I have heard through these years where it's like, well, I'm not good at it. I don't want to deal with it. And then there's been others that are like, well, it's just not my thing. Why do you think that is, that women don't get involved in the financial ends of their marriage?
I think a lot of women like they look at it as a masculine job. It's something that they can just hand off, and they're going to fulfill the other roles, and their husband's going to take over certain things. But it makes me nuts, actually, when I hear someone say that they have merged all of their finances and they don't have separate credit cards, and they have joint bank accounts and nothing separate. And, that's the thing. And I've actually put some content out about that. It's like, hey, ladies, like, make sure you have your own bank account, your own credit card, build your own credit. And some of the comments have always been, well, you're setting them up for divorce. No. It's setting each of you, because it's healthy for each of you to have that, some independence, so that you feel like you have that independence. You don't have to go and get permission to access money. I have friends that I know have to get permission, and it breaks my heart. So I'm like, if you're working and you actually can't go and buy something or spend that weekend with girlfriends without having your spouse approve of it, then that sort of takes out extinguishes the fire in you. Like it takes out like a little bit away from your independence and how you feel as a human. And that goes for men too, because I do see it on the opposite, where women have sole control of the finances and the men have to do that. I think in any relationship, both should have separate things. You can have joint as well, but it's so important to create some financial independence separate from each other. And then you never have to make life choices based on money. And, so many people will say, I can't file for divorce now because I don't have the money to hire a lawyer or have access to it, or they're afraid to access it. And, every decision that you should make should be because it's a heart-based decision. It's right. It's the next step, and not because of a lack of not having what you need and resources in order to do that.
Or desperation,
Yeah.
like I have to stay in this abusive relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that that's over the years. Obviously, we haven't had enough generations of women. Like I even think back when I started my first business in 1999, like my mom was like, do you want to be a teacher or a nurse?
Oh yeah.
I'm like, I don't like blood, and I don't necessarily know that I'm like smart enough to be a teacher. So I don't want to do either of those things. So I just don't think we've had enough generations of women yet that this is a normal, natural thing for you to be financially independent on your own to make financial decisions. And I heard someone once in a relationship, they're probably married for a couple, 20, 25 years, couple decades. And they said that they have theirs and then each other's, his, hers, and theirs, basically, right? And they always did this. If it was under a certain amount, then they were pretty affluent. So if it was under like $25,000, they could do whatever. But once it was over that, obviously like to buy a car or a house, that they would consult on it. To me, that seemed pretty reasonable, right? Because you also don't want to be on the other side where someone has their own and they're spending, or they have a gambling addiction, or they have a problem in some way, and you're almost blind to that. So I don't know how you feel about that, but I always say too, like in business, I always talk about having these State of the Union meetings. And I think it's perfectly fine to do that with yourselves, to have a financial date with your spouse and talk about what are your goals, what are your expenses. Because I think there's a lot of shame around this too. And it's something that you talk about in the book. And so if anyone's listening right now and they have a little bit of shame because of a past relationship, because of a past divorce, or I've been married and divorced all these times, or I can't find someone, is there anything you can do to help someone unpack and kind of get out of that shame? Because it's not going to do us any good.
I love this question because I was that person. Like I had so much shame around my 2 divorces, and I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to share it. I thought it was a reflection of me. I felt like a failure. And then something crazy happened is I actually went on a friend's podcast, and she started asking me about my divorces, and I started speaking it. And then I realized that women were messaging me and they're like, that's my story too. Thank you for talking about shame. And the best way to get over shame is to put words to it. Is to start speaking about it, and not go on Facebook and disparage your ex and talk about it that way, but start infusing it into your story and say, okay, this is something that I've gone through. This is a season in my life. I've experienced this. I've been divorced, and kind of own it. The more you speak it, the less shame you have around it. Now I have no problem getting on podcasts. Like, yeah, I'm twice divorced. It's part of my story. It's part of my journey. And the more that you actually, anything, regardless of what that is, from getting fired to filing bankruptcy, all of those things that we attach shame to, when you start speaking it and having it part of your story, then people connect with you too. And they feel like, oh, this is a person. They're not just a photo filtered life. This is someone who's speaking their truth, and they're being vulnerable. And you could inspire someone else to be vulnerable as well.
Yeah. And I love how you said that, because you also don't like speaking your truth. I've always had a little bit of like against that word because of what people do with it. A lot of times people think speaking your truth gives you the ability to bash someone else.
Yeah, no.
But I think we can stand in who we are, what we've done, the mistakes that we've had, and we can use it from our lens. As far as like even talking about divorce, it's like, here's what I experienced. And it's not necessarily pointing blame or responsibility. It's kind of like taking responsibility. I think AA, I'm not sober, but I know a lot of people that are and have gone through that. That seems to be one of the things that they do consistently, right? Talk about it. Because like you said, when you put words to it, it's no longer as heavy.
And that's it. The longer that you continue to point the finger at somebody and you blame somebody else, you'll continue to play that victim. So when I talk about my divorces, there's plenty I can say. There's plenty of fingers to point, but I'm not going to do that. It's like, how do I own this? And what was my role in that? And that's from the lens that which I speak it. The most I will say that's bad is I'll say I had a second marriage that was toxic. I will never say much more about that, because that's not even what the story's about. It's how did I end up there? What choices did I make? What cycles were I repeating? Like that's from this where the story is. It has nothing to do with the other person. So it's taking any of your difficult stories, the hardest ones that are to speak, and it's how can you spin that and turn that into an opportunity to bring power back to that and, teach that or talk about it in a different way. And it has absolutely nothing to do with pointing the finger and continuing to perpetuate that victimhood.
And the same thing applies to business, right? Business and investments, like people make a bad business decision, they make a bad investment, they get involved with the wrong partner. And rather than looking at what are all of these bad things that I, did, or who was this bad person, this person took advantage of me, what did you ignore? What maybe gut instinct did you have that you ignored? How can you take responsibility and learn from it so that you make better decisions down the road? Like, I think we're all just humans on this experiment, right? We're all just trying to figure things out and learn and then not have as many expectations. And I love that you talk about this towards the last half of your book, where you talk about expectations and how to release them. And I think this is so hard to do in business, in relationships, to not have expectations of other people or even a situation. How can people that maybe are having these expectations really release them with just anything that they're struggling with right now?
And so that's probably the defining thing of someone who comes out of their divorce and they're excited about their future and they're thriving, and someone who gets stuck and continuously looks in the past and points their finger. It's everything to do with expectation, because they come out, the one who's holding on to this expectation of how much they're going to get, what their lifestyle will look like, what the judge will or will not do to their spouse, will determine whether they're happy with that or not. Most times expectations are not met. And so the person who releases all expectations and says, my expectations is that I get divorced. Success, 100% success rate, if that's what your expectation is, and everything else you're going to let fall into place. And I think that goes for anything. Anytime we have an expectation, releasing a book, the expectation of what sales are going to be. It's like when you hold on to that, if you don't get that mark, if you don't reach that goal, you're going to be disappointed. And then you forget about what you did achieve to get up to that. Look at leaving the relationship, how the courage it took to take that first step forward, putting the book in the world, the work that it took to release that. No matter what that is, it's like, let's look back and just appreciate every single thing that you did to get to that point, and then allow, I'm a big believer in allowing things to unfold the way that they're meant to, allowing sometimes we think we know what we need and want, and it's not necessarily the best thing for us. And having some faith that you're going to land on your feet and it's going to unfold exactly the way it's supposed to. And that's hard, especially for overachievers, for type A's, for entrepreneurs. It's really hard to release control. It's something that I've struggled with. I struggle with probably every single day, is because I want to jam it into my timeline and what what I determine as successful. But it's, I also remind myself every single day, I can do what I can do within my power, and then I'll release it and let go.
Yeah. And I think it comes into faith too, right? Like understanding even the divorces or the relationship or the bad business deal. It's like understanding that every single one of those challenges were actually getting you to where you are now. And I think the best way that people, if you look back at the divorce, at something that you experienced and say, would I have become who I am right now if I didn't go through that challenge? And most people that I meet, they don't have a regret about the challenge. In the moment they do, right? While you're experiencing it. But I always say, I think that the intersection of ambition and appreciation is really what creates a rich life. And I think that what you're doing in this book is really great, because you're showing people how they can release that shame and those expectations and really create any life that they want. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's having that gratitude for the hard, having gratitude for the suck. It's really easy to be grateful when things are good. It's so hard to be grateful when things suck, but it's doing it anyway and finding that little glimmer within that really hard point. And I think that makes all the difference on how we come out the other side and what our perspective is and what our mindset is and how we look at the future and what we decide to do next. It's when we have a little bit of gratitude for the hard journey that we've been on and recognizing yes, I don't have any regrets because it brought me right here. This book would not be the book it is had I not gone through those 2 divorces. So every life lesson brings you, a step closer to who you're actually meant to be.
Yeah, I love that. And if if you could wave a magic wand and every single person that bought this book just had maybe 1 or 2 takeaways from it, that it will feel like your hard work was worth it, what would one of those 2 of those things be?
I'd say take the risk and act fast. Because I think so many people get stuck in their head and they talk themselves out of things that they want to do. So commit to taking that risk and going for it. You'll never regret it, even if it doesn't work, even if you fail, and then go fast. Like take that first jump fast, because think about all the people that you and I know who want to do things and they think about like, I'll do it another time. I'll go for it when the kids are older, when I have more money saved, when there's more money in my 401k, whatever the excuse is that's holding them back. Sometimes you just have to act and then let things fall into place and allow momentum to take over.
I love that. I agree 100%. I almost hit the desk once. Because I see so often 2 things you made me think of. People, they feel the fear and they don't do it anyways. And they have fear of what other people will say, or fear of failure, or fear of this. But I think as you get into a certain stage of life, you realize how short life is.
Yeah.
And that I would much rather go after anything and fail or not hit the mark than wonder on my deathbed at 95 years old, oh, what if I would have wrote that book? Or what if I would have moved across the country? Or what if I would have taken that vacation? Like, to me, don't have those regrets. And that's really what you're telling people, is don't have those regrets, go after it anyways. And I feel like there's a lot of just BS that happens in our mind, right? And we all have our own version of this. And you talk about this. Can you maybe unpack that a little bit about how everyone has their own version of their BS, maybe what that is and how you can help us get past it?
Yeah. I mean, you go straight back to your childhood, right? Like we can blame our parents for everything, but your version of BS usually goes back there. So, so many people, so many women I know actually avoid conflict. And that goes back to whatever was going on in their household. Maybe there was a high conflict household. And so they want to avoid that in their current life. Well, what does that do? A lot of resentment builds. And that could be relationships that you're in, a marriage or work relationships where you're not having those conversations because you want to avoid it. So that's the BS story that's holding you back. Some people are money stories, the BS of that lack of not having enough. But, there's things that come up for us over and over again that we see, that we latch onto. And sometimes it's because we want to feel safe, depending on how we grew up. If we grew up with less than, you want to feel safe. Like I talk about it in the book, but at one point my parents were cleaning medical buildings to make ends meet. And that's before I could go out with my friends. My brother and I had to go and empty the barrels and vacuum. And then we were released to go see our friends. And when I started my law firm, I was cleaning my building myself because I was like, well, there's not going to be enough, and until I let go of that old story of feeling like there was never going to be enough, I was never going to move forward. So it's getting really clear on that. Whatever it is that shows up for you over and over, think about what your childhood was like and maybe where some of that comes from so that you can release it, because we all have some level of BS that's keeping us from our potential.
Yeah. And that's something to remember too, anyone that's dealing with something or in a relationship, to look back, and it doesn't give you an excuse to have crappy behavior now or to be a shitty person to people, but it helps you understand, right? And I think that's what's powerful about it, is same thing, if you're dealing with someone else in a relationship or in business or just in the world, someone on social media, right? If you just start to understand, wow, what did that person experience to make them act like that? Or wow, what is this person? I feel like then you can have empathy for someone else, even when you're not sure what it is that they're going through.
You can understand. And then, like I always say, sometimes even so, people are not meant for you. You can bless and release and send them off with love. And sometimes other people's stuff is not your stuff. We can't save everyone. We can't do the work for other people. And that especially is true for our spouses. It's like you can only lead so much, and you may have a spouse who's not on that same journey with you for personal development. And if they're not, at some point you have to decide, is this okay? Or is it time to release them and allow them to go on their own journey?
Yeah. So good. I want to talk for a hot second, and I have a final question. So people that are listening to this point, I want them to know where they can get the book, where they can find out more about it. So tell us where we can find that.
So any major bookseller will have it. And also you can connect with me on Instagram at Ms. Renee Bauer. I'm constantly in there and responding to DMs.
Awesome. So She Who Wins, grab this book anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and then we will link all of the information at the bottom. But I want to make sure that we touch on this because I think when people hear the word wealth, they often think of money, right? And I think we both know, and I know you personally, so I can say that we both know that there are different things also that create wealth. And I'd love to know, 20 years in, all of these clients, you see the worst of people sometimes, right? Inside of divorces. What does the definition of wealth, what does that word feel to you, mean to you now at this stage in your life?
Yeah, wealth is time. You know, it's time back to do what you want, to be who you are, sometimes just to be. Wealth is peace. And it's, you know, that's a big one because a lot of people have such turmoil and they're constantly chasing something. And even if you're in a perfect relationship, you're chasing that next goal as an entrepreneur, and it's hard to have peace where you are. You know, I think that wealth is having resilience and tenacity to continue to go after something that's so important to you and not give up. And there isn't dollar signs attached to that. It's, you know, for me, it was traditionally publishing a book, and, you know, our stories are so different. I had over 100 rejections from literary agents before I got the yes. And I was not going to give up because I'm a writer. I have something to say. And so for me, that feels it's so wealthy to me because it's like I had this dream that I didn't give up on.
I love that. No one has ever used that definition in all of our episodes. And I think that that's, if nobody got any other value other than that, because to me, if you have those skill sets, tenacity and being relentless, even if you lose all of the monetary wealth you have, you'll be able to build it back at any time. So I love that. And I just want to acknowledge you. You know, I know that She Who Wins, you're writing this for women and the men that also love these women. And I know that little Renee would be so proud of you and so happy for who you've become and what you're putting out in the world and the difference that you're making and just your presence and your energy. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and acknowledge you. For everyone listening, get the book. It is going to be an incredible book coming out next week. What is that? September 5th. Oh my gosh, September 5th. So grab your copy, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And then for anyone listening, we are going to give a couple copies away. So screenshot this episode, tag myself at Candy Valentino and at Miss Renee Bauer, correct? On Instagram. And we will send 10 copies to the winners of the book. So thank you for writing this book. Thank you for getting it out. I hope that every single woman that's listening and every man that loves a woman listening will get a copy for their spouse. And thanks for being on the show and sharing this time with me.
Thank you for having me.